All right. Hi, everyone, again. This is I'm not even sure, ninth or 10th salon of this series, Ideas Shape the World. And as Billy and Jacob already know, I think I'm Robert Nemeth. I'm the host of this series. And from now on, I will be joined the co-host, my old friend, Ferenc Laczo, who is a historian and he's an associate professor at the University of Maastricht, and from January he will also teach at the Columbia University. And today we also have a special guest, LaTosha Brown. Thank you so much, LaTosha, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
LaTosha is an award-winning organizer, philanthropic consultant, political strategist, and jazz singer with over 20 years of experience working in the nonprofit and philanthropy sectors on a wide variety of issues related to political empowerment, social justice, economic development, leadership development, wealth creation, and civil rights. And she's the co-founder of Black Voters Matter Fund, a power-building civic engagement organization. And I don't think we could have a better guest for today's topic. So thank you again, LaTosha, for accepting our invitation. And let me start with the first question. I'm not sure that all of the audience is familiar with your organization, Black Voters Matter. So could you please introduce it in a few words? And also, could you please talk about what was the driving force behind launching this fund?
Okay. Well, the first thing I did right was the day I started to fight. Keep your eyes on the prize and hold on, hold on. That's a civil rights song. We use freedom songs when we have been organizing civil rights movements in our country. And primarily I grew up in Selma, Alabama, which was instrumental and known for the voting rights movement. In 2016, my business partner and I, Cliff Albright, had a vision. We had been doing political organizing all throughout the South for over 25 years. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to build an organization that would do three particular things. One, that we wanted to move money on the ground to help build grassroots power, that we felt like in order to strengthen a democracy, that local communities and grassroots organizations need to have some capacity and to build that ecosystem. The second thing we wanted to do is to make sure that we were shifting the message, that we're in a moment now that things are driven by message, and so we wanted to make sure that we had a message that was more reflective of an affirmative message around Black voters in this nation, that we had power, we had impact, and we had influence on the outcome of elections. And so we wanted to drive and shape a message that actually affirmed that and center our constituency group that we were organizing around. And the third thing is that we wanted to make sure that we were lifting up and building and expanding the movement. And our strategy of doing so was that we would build out the ecosystem, that we would not necessarily we didn't have a mission to create small Black Voters Matter chapters, but that people who were already in local communities, who were embedded in local communities, who are already responding to the needs of those communities. We know who those people are. We know that when there's a fire in a community, who's going to show up. We know that when there's a problem that happens in the community, who will show up and help. And we want to make sure that we're helping them to build their capacity. And so we do that in a number of ways of providing them support and funding. And so we created the organization in 2016 to do just that, to how do we focus on building what we say is we're building power and spreading love. And we do that in those are our kind of big three strategies around moving money, and strengthening the ecosystem for movement, and shaping a message that affirms who we are in our constituency.
Okay, thank you so much for this explanation. Now, let's go a bit back in time. Our topic today is the civil rights movement. And when we talk about it, we mostly think of the 50s and 60s. And could you please talk us a little bit about what was the context of the emergence of the movement, and why was there a need for it back then?
I think as long as there are human beings are on the earth, there's going to be a need for us to also recognize that they have human rights, they have civil rights as well, and those rights must be protected. We know the civil rights movement in particular in the U.S. from the 50s and 60s, because that was the heightened moment for it in this country, this nation, where we actually were challenging those laws that were on the books that actually said that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator. We wanted to make that be real, not just on paper. We wanted to challenge that and make that be real. We wanted to make sure that we had actually equal access to move around, that we had equal access to be able to do the things just to carry out our normal lives as human beings. And so what we saw is we saw this massive movement that actually influenced and impacted the world in the 50s and 60s. You know, I would say that that movement didn't start in the 50s, nor did it end in the 60s. It started, I would say that it started from the moment in which we actually set foot, Africans were actually brought as enslaved Africans on this land, that fundamentally that as governments start, there's always a framework of who actually has legal rights, who also their humanity has their rights that are connected to their humanity, or they're just them being a civilian. And so in that space, what we saw, and I think what made the 50s and the 60s so profound, and why we think of that as that is when the civil rights movement took place, is because not only was it challenging the power, but it was actually challenging the premise. This a premise in America of all people being created equal. Is challenging this premise of, will this country have a multiracial democracy that actually will apply its rights to all of its people, all of its citizens across the board? And so while that was like the highlight of it, and I think that it brought it to global prominence because of the caliber, I think, of leadership. I think the level of the argument, I think in the time which we were in a very transitional moment in this nation's history, that what we see is we see a reemergence of that. And I do think that there were a couple of things that led to that. I think one of the things that we saw in the last 10 years was the Black Lives Matter movement. That one of the things that I think that the Black Lives Matter movement did is it ignited a new generation of activists to get engaged and to think about human rights, think about climate justice, think about civil rights, think about those things in a more comprehensive, reflective way than I think that we've seen even in previous generations, which I'm a part of as Generation X, right? You know, I came out of the generation that they told us to go to college, get a degree, get a good job with benefits. That's what the goal was. It was like we were the first generation in many ways, particularly my family in the South, to actually benefit from some of the wins of the civil rights movement. And so many of us were actually kind of pushed to accelerate, to take advantage of, from affirmative action, to create businesses, to be able to get into college, which many of our people could not get in before, to be able to use and exercise your right to vote. I remember my grandfather was born in 1910, 1905. My grandmother was born in 1910. Most of their adult life, they were not able, they were in Alabama, were able to vote. So they actually put a lot of emphasis on these civil rights that now had some protection behind it because of the civil rights laws and the voting rights laws. And then what we saw is this pendulum swing, that what happened, I think, in the Black Lives Matter movement, that they actually pushed it a step further. That it's not just about kind of the civil rights having it on the book. It is actually about the actualization of making sure that those rights are protected. And there's something called human rights, that the world actually has a better understanding in the global space oftentimes than what we talk about here in this nation in America. And so they were pushing this whole notion of that human beings, that we all have rights, and that we should be able to exercise that right, particularly in a democracy. And that if a democracy is to be stronger, then it must be a reflective democracy, where it's reflective of the will and the needs of the people that make up that democracy. And so I think, in many ways, I think the Black Lives Matter movement it ignited something. It was the introduction. It was an access point for new generations, Generation Z and the millennials, to actually be engaged in a movement what we had not seen as a large-scale movement of that magnitude since the 60s. I was born in 70. I'm 52. This was over 50 years ago, where there had been the largest movement. And what we do know is that movements create these on-ramps for people to get involved. And so what we saw right after the unfortunate killing and murder of George Floyd, as you saw young people really were angry and pissed off and were like, how could this happen? And there's something, and that anger had to be directed somewhere. And so that anger and that concern, and so what movements are an excellent opportunity, right? To be able to give these opportunities for that energy to actually be directed in such a way that you're actually moving towards progress. It's kind of like having Gas is good. You can take petroleum out of a car, you put fire on it, it'll burn. But you can actually put gas in a car, in a lawnmower, a mechanical pieces, and it actually propels them. The burn off of that energy allows it to run. And so I think that's what movements have the ability to do. It creates a way that you can actually channel and direct that energy in such a way that it can advance a cause. It can advance an agenda. And so that's what we saw, I think, and continue to see. I feel like while my organization is not directly connected to the Black Lives Matter movement, as an organizer, I'm someone who had been an organizer for 27 years and had been doing a lot of work on the ground. And then even for me, when the Black Lives Matter movement took place, I had to question myself, am I doing enough? Right. And my answer to myself is I wasn't. I was like, no, I need to do more. And not only do I need to do more, in my mind, there were a couple of things I wanted to do. While I had been a civil rights activist, being an individual activist for me was not enough. That I knew that what I wanted institutional change. I wanted structural change. And to get things at scale, if you're really trying to make movement change, or you're trying to make change at scale, what you also need is something that can actually carry out and help build that scale. And so for me, I believe that I needed to help build an institution that could actually help us build capacity of grassroots groups that were doing work on the ground, by giving them money, by giving them training, by connecting them, by building out an ecosystem, by having a shared message and being able to actually lift up this affirmative message that can actually move us forward. And so it was kind of out of that movement that you saw a lot of organizations kind of pop up, because we were inspired and motivated. And it was all, in many ways, it was like a call to action.
Again, if we could talk a bit about what were the major successes of the civil rights movement, and what were some of the shortcomings? What were the things that really remained on the table and needed to be addressed later?
So I think the successes of the civil rights movement is, I think that we called the question around what was American democracy, like literally call the question around American democracy, and would it be inclusive, and would we have a representative government? As a result of that, what you see now is we are now in an era that we have more women, more people of color ever in the history of this nation that are now in representative office, all the way to as high as the vice president's office, and as we know, previously we had President Obama, which was the first African American. None of that would have been possible without the civil rights movement. None of it. Right. What it did is it created a pathway for us to have a more representative and reflective government, right, and government structure. And so as a result, what you now know, what we have now, we've got hundreds of elected officials that are people of color and women, because the civil rights movement not only helped support and open up the space for communities of color, but also women as well. And so all women, including white women. And so now what you see at the highest levels of government, you are seeing representative constituencies from the Asian American community, from the African American community, from our Latino brothers and sisters, from all segments of the population. I think the civil rights movement, we have to recognize that while it was certainly led, that what we saw as the face of the leadership primarily were Black people, that ultimately it opened up the space and provided access, a more open, accessible democracy for all of the citizens of this nation, white, Black, whoever it is. And so I think that was one of the greatest success. The second piece that I think was a major success that we don't often talk about is that while it was the civil rights movement, there was a very, very strong faith component of it. We are now seeing faith be used in such a way politically that it is weaponized around people. It's really interesting that it's weaponized against people, whether it's from their gender to their sexuality to who they are. Like, we're seeing this reactionary, conservative Christian wing that I would say what I call it is Confederate Christianity. That's not the Christianity that I'm familiar with, that actually has a whole set system that what their God is white supremacy, right? And so part of what we saw in the civil rights movement is we saw a faith-based movement I think one of the earliest faith-based movements that came out of the abolitionist movement, because the abolitionist movement was actually a faith-based movement in the U.S. that actually called for the end of slavery. There was a moral component to it, that the enslavement of other human beings was fundamentally wrong, that literally the annihilation and the genocide of Native and Indigenous people, that was fundamentally and morally wrong. And so there was a thread around the integrity and the moral that's having this moral responsibility. I think that the civil rights movement actually did that as well, that there was a moral responsibility that we have, that every single person has agency, that this belief that it's not just about voting because of a political system. There is a belief that if any decision is being made about me, my family, or other people, I should have a right to be able to be a part of that decision-making process, or in fact, that actually marginalizes or undermines my my humanity, right? In addition to that, there was this moral notion that there should be a way that law should not be in the way that they're inflicting pain on its citizens, that it is supposed to serve the people, be of the people, for the people, and by the people. And I think what the civil rights movement did is it called that question. It put it on the table. Is this government going to be of the people, for the people, by the people? How can you weaponize the government, right, against its own people and claim that you are a democracy, or seek to be the model democracy for the world? And so I think part of what we saw in the civil rights movement is we saw this interesting kind of dichotomy, right, around what was real and what was the kind of the perception of what America wanted to spread around the world, and what was the actual context of governance and participation and civic participation. I think a third element of the civil rights movement that I think was really powerful was that it was grassroots centered. And I always use this kind of analogy of a tree. You know, you can have a big, strong, beautiful tree, and the leaves can fall off. Like some of us that live in parts of the world that we have 4 seasons, we know that when it's fall season, the leaves fall off the tree. It's still a tree. It's still alive. It's still flourishing. You can even have branches to break. If you've had a storm, the branches will break. You can cut branches down. The tree will still be the tree. The one thing that you can't do, though, is if you ever can disconnect the tree from its roots, the tree automatically dies. And so we actually believe that about political power in this nation, all around the world, that you can have the leaves and you can have the leadership, but anytime that you have a democracy, right, that is not rooted in the ground, that is not rooted in this core value and belief that it should be of the people, for the people, and by the people, then in fact, that tree is vulnerable, if not dead. And so for us, I think what the civil rights movement showed was that at the root of the movement were common, everyday, working class people who said that we should have the right to make sure that that we have agency, our agency acknowledged. We should have the right to freely participate in the system that governs us, that we have the right to be able to shape the policy and the laws that impact our communities and our families. And I think it is that I think has been a model around the world, that when we think about Dr. King's message and the leaders' messages, when we think about what that message was, there was a greater message. There was a message, yes, it was around political participation, but it was greater than that. It was really around the acknowledgement of one's humanity, to have agency or being part of shaping the governance of their community and their families.
Now, the civil rights movement has also given rise to a number of global icons, right? Some of the participants are famous the world over. Rosa Parks, of course, her name is in the title of our conversation today. Martin Luther King, you have just mentioned him. Malcolm X, I would say, is probably a third one. I wanted to ask you how you relate to these people and what they have done. What is your personal relationship to their activism?
I will say, if they did not exist, neither would I. I, as an activist, my entire philosophy towards organizing has been shaped in the studying of the work that they've done, in their writings, in their speeches. I am a huge fan of both Dr. King and of Malcolm X. I consider myself students of them both. I consider myself a student of Ida B. Wells, who was a journalist, who was a female journalist, who literally was one of the leaders of the suffrage movement, even though I think her voice was marginalized greatly in that. And then she used her journalism to actually lift up the anti-lynching movement that happened in the U.S. And as a result, what we saw is her work literally made a significant impact on stopping kind of lynchings, the frequency and the scale of lynchings happening in the U.S. When we look at people like Fannie Lou Hamer, out of all of them, that's the person who I identify with probably the most. The way that Fannie Lou Hamer, who was a former sharecropper in Mississippi, a woman that technically, by society standards, did not have a lot of status, right? Education status. She did not have a lot of economic status because she was a sharecropper, which was a sharecropper system in the US, is where you worked on someone else's land. It literally was a hybrid between slavery and farming, that if you worked on someone else's land, but quite frankly, the way that the system was designed, you were constantly indebted to them. So you were growing on their land in hopes that you would be able to graduate out of there. But the way the system was, this racist system, is such a way that it actually was just another phase of evolution of slavery in many ways, because many people who worked on that land, they would work on the land, they lived in whoever the landowner, they lived in their space, they lived, they ate the food that they gave them, and then at the end of when they would have their crops to sell and get the profits from their crops, there was no profit. They was, oh no, you lived on our land, you worked for us. So it was really another a crafty way. And I'm saying crafty really was another evil way of really being able to institutionalize slavery. And so, she had been a sharecropper in Mississippi. And this was a woman that when the movement, when the civil rights movement and some of the leaders of the civil rights movement came through Mississippi to get Black people registered in the state of Mississippi, she would go to the mass meetings. And what she was known for, which is part of the reason why I sing before I speak, in every setting that I'm in, she literally would use her in these meetings. She would sing and use her voice, and the way that they found her actually was her voice. They were organizing, looking for some organizers in Mississippi. It was like, who was that woman that always sing at the mass meetings? And they found her, and she became a amazing organizer for the organization and registered people in Mississippi. But more than that, she became the consciousness. She was the voice of consciousness of the pain. She was able to articulate the pain, the frustration, the anger, the joy, and the hopefulness of people who were in the movement. Everyday poor people, right, who often did not have a voice or didn't have a platform. She was so powerful, had such a profound presence that actually she was a part of a movement of people in Mississippi who went to the Democratic National Convention, which is one of the major parties in the U.S., and went to actually speak. They had gotten votes to be seated as delegates to be able to vote for the president nominee. And the Mississippi party, the state party, which was ran by the white people, the white races at the time, refused to let them take those seats. And so as a result, she actually had a press conference to speak. This woman, this sharecropper, was so powerful that the president actually had a press conference at the same time so that her speech would not be televised on national TV. And so I think what I learned from people like Fannie Lou Hamer, I get different lessons from them. Fannie Lou Hamer teaches me about my voice. She teaches me how the power of an authentic voice, the people that are best prepared to speak to issues are those people who are directly impacted by those issues. And so I think part of what was so profound and why she was such a good organizer is because she was organizing other people that also knew that she was from Mississippi, that she was a sharecropper, that they could identify with her and they could see themselves in her, even as they were doing their work. And so that's why I learned from her, and how you use the power of your voice to really be able to challenge those things are not right, but also put fire in the people, to ignite the fire in the people. What I get from Dr. King was a brilliant, brilliant theologian. We know him as a leader, but as a person, as a person of faith, the way that he was actually able to connect liberatory justice, right, and faith and politics had a profound and continues to have a profound impact on me. that he certainly saw this as a moral movement. He didn't see this just as a political movement. He saw this as a moral movement, and that we as people have a moral responsibility to look after the least of these, at all of us, but particularly the least of these. And that's what was so profound for me about him. You know, what I got from Malcolm X is Malcolm X shapes my belief around self-determination. That Malcolm X was a Pan-Africanist, but he was very astute to being able not only to call out some of the inconsistencies and the hypocrisies, you know, in the American political system, or in America just in general, but he also was able to give us a North Star and say that you don't have to be dependent on this system. You can be self-determined and have the audacity to create new systems and new ways that you're actually forcing things to take place in your community, that you're not constantly a victim to what already exists, but using your imagination, using your radical imagination and your power to move forward. That's what I get from him. I get from writers like James Baldwin, who was a profound, prolific writer, you know, this notion, this idea of how we actually have to re-examine, even in our community, as a gay Black man, during a time where we didn't have gay rights in this nation, to be bold enough and courageous enough to stand in the fullness of who he was in every aspect of who he was, right? He was a man of faith. He was a gay man, African. He was a Black man. He was all of those things that literally would have him on the fringes or the margins of society. He actually leaned into that. And as a result, here we are years and years and years after his death, still being inspired and motivated by the work that he does. And so when I look at the movement, I can go on and on and on and on about the people that you wouldn't know their names, that I talked to, that I grew up around, who were on the bridge, who had participated. My mother, Rosetta Gamble, was the first at the age of 16. She and Bertie Mae Davis filed the lawsuit that actually integrated high schools in the state of Alabama. My mother graduated with 3,000 whites in a very hostile environment, as only 2 African-American women. And so in that process, there's so many people. That's the beauty of movements. They're the people that we know, that we know them, that are historical figures and leaders. And then there are people that everyday folks who actually brought what they had, gave what they had to give, and they believe that we could make change. And as a result, we're all benefiting from their work, from their courage, from their visions.
Since music seems to play such an essential role, both to you personally and in the activism you do, I wanted to ask you whether you would like to highlight some musicians, maybe some singers who are particularly important today when you look at Black Lives Matter and all the activism around it. What's the role of music today?
So you know what? It's interesting. I'm going to do old and new, because I do think old influences today too. So let me bring up someone like Nina Simone. So while Nina Simone is not here, Nina Simone's music is really interesting, because many people, Nina Simone has long passed, and many people, her music could be heavy, and for some it could even be dark. But there was something that was the raw truthfulness, heaviness of it, right? She had written a song called Mississippi Goddamn. Well, she had redone that a song. I think Billie Holiday also did, when she did Strange Fruit, that they had this really interesting way of being able to integrate, politicize us through their music and capture what people were feeling. And so I think that she had an amazing way that even from this to this day, I still pull from Billie Holiday's and Nina Simone's work. Earth, Wind, and Fire was a group in the 70s that at the end of the day, they had this song, they had this music that basically is interesting, because they had these really ornate spaceship outfits they would wear, but they forced you, I think, to think about love, and we could do better, and there's joy, and there's we can be happy. There's a space around like claiming your joy and your happiness that I think was really profound and laid the foundation. Today, the people who are still making music, you know, who I think is the king of the king and the master of the master of being able to make that kind of music, who I literally think is prophetic. I actually think that he is a prophet of our times. And I'm so glad to be walking the earth with him. And that is Stevie Wonder, that he is a wonder. If you go back and you listen to Stevie Wonder's music, right, going to higher ground, this is someone that literally would use his lyrics, use his music, use his brilliance, to really be able to have you, before you know it, you're moving and you're grooving in the song, and you don't even know why you feel good. You hear the song, you hear the lyrics. And so I think that he has made a profound impact on the world, literally using music. And at that intersection, I literally think that Stevie Wonder and I think Miss Coretta Scott King was absolutely the most significant person leading to the national holiday of Dr. King's holiday. But it is Stevie Wonder. Is a close second. That Stevie Wonder used the power of music, and even something as simple as a birthday song. Happy birthday to you. You know, we sing that now, but that song actually caught fire and root before the holiday was passed. And so it became this kind of like this rallying cry. And that's a fundamental way you use music. And then my favorite right now is a beautiful woman from the South that you may have heard of called Beyonce. And so I just recently went to, I'm a big Beyonce fan. I am in the Beehive. I just went to Beyonce's concert last weekend. Matter of fact, I went to 2 of her shows. It was the most profound, amazing thing that I've gone to. The way that she has, not just as a singer, not just as an artist, the way that she actually, people who have been on the fringes, the trans community, the house music community, the gay community, how in many ways, even within our own communities, how they've been marginalized and isolated, to really acknowledge their contribution to the culture, right? Even their contribution to the culture of movement, even their contribution to actually the acceptance of self. The way that has been celebrated, and the way that she celebrated it on her last album, I actually think that that's a movement in itself. This whole notion of Renaissance and being able to see this, it's something about, like, there's something, even going to the concert, what I saw and what I felt in the concert is people came as they were. If there are people that wanted to have a big aluminum foil hat, they wore that. If they wanted to come with a broad top on and pants, there was something very liberatory and free and beautiful. And I remember looking in the audience, I was like, isn't this the world we want? Like, people to be free, to be who they are, and to be joyous with it, and to be happy. Why does it bother me with what you got on, right? Why do I care about who you sleep with? Like, what does that have to do with me? That at the end of the day, whatever's gonna make you happy, right? I want you to have that kind of joy. And I think there's something, I think in her work, and what I've seen in recent years in her work, is this very this focal point around Black joy. On how do we create this music to be a music and the soundtrack of a movement, to give people a space to release, to give people a space to reimagine. I mean, this woman was flying across the stadium on a platinum horse. I mean, come on, right? You know, to give us a space to imagine, to stretch ourselves, and to give us a space to accept ourselves and accept others.
I wanted us to perhaps turn to the politics of recent decades, right? When we think about US politics, I think the thing that comes to everybody's mind is the election of Obama. Very crucial moment, something that really resonated across the world. And there was, of course, an idea that the US is moving towards something like a post-racial democracy. Now, we know that there was a rise of white supremacist movements, and again, also around the election of Donald Trump in 2016. How have you experienced these events, right? The election of Obama, and then this major backlash that also followed it?
That's a fantastic question. Let me say, I think 2 things can actually be true. I think one, there is some level of, there has been movement towards racial justice. The challenge, though, is representation. While it matters, that in itself does not mean that the problem has been fixed. You know, if anybody has had a busted pipe in their house, right, you can go and sometimes you can go and get some tape and put it on the pipe, and they'll last for a little while, but eventually you got to deal with the pipe, right? I'm saying that because I think that's how we have to deal with that's, America has a way of dealing with race like I just described. Like, let's go take the tape and then we're going to tape the pipe up and then everything's going to be okay, right? When in fact that there has to be you might need an entire plumbing system replaced. That plumbing system does not serve the new reality. And so I think I'm saying that because I think what we saw with Obama was not that was a fluke or that was a one-off. I do think that this country is getting more diverse. This country is younger. It's the youngest that it's ever been. It is the most diverse that it has ever been. And so what you're seeing is, as you're seeing this major transition and generational change, what you're seeing is this sea of new people entering the process and to want something different, want something. I mean, we all know in the Obama campaign, when people couldn't even tell you his platform, what they could tell you is, yes, I can. Yes, we can. So there was something very powerful in this idea of this fundamental belief. Are we getting close to this notion that we can actually build this multiracial, multi-generational democracy together? And so I still think that belief lives there, right? But also, if you are a history buff, or if you're a student of history in the US, you would know that there's never been Black progress in this nation, and there wasn't a white backlash, ever. There's never, you cannot find one incident that there was not a white backlash, because quite frankly, the truth of the matter is the foundation of this country was based on supporting on white male patriarchy. Hence, quote, the founders of this nation, all white men. They weren't the only people in the nation, but they were the ones that, quite frankly, that they were the only ones that were listened to, that were heard, that were actually put themselves in positions of leadership, of power, and created systems to make sure that their interests were protected. And so part of what I think what we're seeing now is we're seeing, the rubber is hitting the road. Now you have this multi-generational, younger democracy, and there are people who have been in power and their power has not been challenged, and has always been that white people are on top, that are quite frankly responding to that, and they're responding it quite viciously and violently. And we saw that January 6th. We see this classic white backlash, which has always been the formula following progress in this nation. And so it's not strange to me that there was a Trump after Obama. I would argue, had there not been a Trump, there would have never been if there had not been an Obama, there would never have been a Trump. Trump would have not had a chance. Like, he was considered a joke, right? Prior to that, or a personality. He was a celebrity kind of personality on TV. And people saw him in that box. But I do think that what he did very well is that he actually codified white supremacy, right? And white power in such a way that people supported him, even if they had to go in and squeeze their nose to vote for him. There were people that voted for him that said, to keep white people on top at all costs, we will support him. And unfortunately, I think we find ourselves in that space again. Here we are with a man who has been indicted in 4 separate courts, including local, state, and federal courts, state and federal courts, and a man who has been twice impeached. A man who many of the people around him have fallen like flies for corruption, right? Who has had his own set of a history of corruption. How is it that someone with that kind of record, this is someone that Obama wore a tan suit, and that was a scandal. So here we have that up against someone who's had all of these problems and all of these, who's been accused by over 20 women of around sexual assault. So you have someone on that breath. I think that shows in itself kind of the gulf of how the lengths that some are willing to go to protect white male patriarchy in this nation. I think that that's indicative of that. And I also think that it is indicative of someone of the resistance to evolve even in this nation.
I'd like to turn to Billy and Jacob, whether you have any questions at the moment.
Do I have any questions?
Billy, Jacob?
I don't think so. Yeah, not at the moment.
Okay. Because we can continue with our questions, of course. Anytime, okay, thanks, Jacob. Anytime you feel like asking something, just let us know and you will receive the floor, of course. But let's go back a little bit to the civil rights movement and the period since then. What do you think has not changed in the society since the civil rights movement?
The plumbing. I'll go back to my previous conversation that this America has never rectified the damage it has done with the exploitation, the enslavement, the genocide of the people that built this nation. It has not dealt with that effectively. It has not dealt. We don't have systems that create. It's interesting. We can move. I can take my cell phone right now and move $1 million within a couple of seconds safely and securely on my cell phone, right? But I had to stand in line for 8 hours to vote on an antiquated system on a machine. Something is not right. And I'm saying that, and what is not right is that there is an intention. There's been an intention in this nation for things to maintain the same. Part of my resistance I actually think that some of as a student, as a political scientist, like as students of political science and history, I actually think that the founders and their thinking around their ideology and their thinking around democracy and the different elements of democracy and the Declaration of Independence, I actually think there's brilliance in that. Absolutely. I can't argue where I think it's brilliance. Do I think that they thought every thought that could be thought? Absolutely not. So what is this notion that in some way that the only people could have ever thought about democracy, right, were those that could not even envision the fullness of the humanity of my ancestors. So I say that to say that as everything evolves, like we no longer use dial tone phones anymore, right? It had to evolve, that it was no longer the most efficient way for us to communicate. We no longer have a computer that is the size of a building so that we can actually just send something in DOS, right? Because it was not the most effective. We allowed that technology to evolve in such a way to actually make it more convenient, more effective, and more efficient. There is an intentional effort to not allow systems that actually serve and allow people to be more engaged in a democratic process. There's an intention to not allow for us to not do that in this nation. We've got antiquated systems. We've got, not just when I'm talking about technology systems, I mean the way that we do things. When we're looking at electoral college, why do we have the electoral college, right? Why is there still a need to have electoral college in this country? Why are we having the same Supreme Court? We're looking at the Supreme Court. Yes, I am I think everything should be up for us to look at what is going to serve, what is going to get us to the point that we can have the most representative, reflective democracy that is possible. Because I think that is where the strength is. That is the strength in the nation. I have a particular way of thinking, and yes, I want things to go the way that I want them to go. But I also recognize that I share the earth with people that think very differently than I think. That I share the earth with people who have different experiences than I think. I share the earth with people who come from a different kind of political context. That is okay for me. That doesn't threaten me. What I actually believe is we have to be sophisticated enough, just like we figured out how to have an iPhone or things that can actually serve us, that I think that why can't we radically reimagine creating systems that allow space for all of us on some level? Will all of us get what we want? Absolutely not. That would be virtually impossible, right? I change my own mind 15 times a week, right? But at the end of the day, I do think that there are some basic fundamental beliefs that if we had in place, and literally things that we had in place, what is wrong with every single person being able to vote? And their vote, whether you're in Rhode Island or Alabama or California, should have the same amount of weight. It should. right? There's nothing wrong with us creating new systems that will actually meet our new reality. So I often push back when there's kind of this notion of, well, what did the founders think, or what did the founders intended? Well, we know that the founders didn't even intend for me to be talking to y'all. The founders intended for me to be on a slave plantation somewhere. So I have no value around limiting myself to their limited beliefs, because they were certainly very limited in their own beliefs, even though I can acknowledge that much of their ideology was very powerful and forward and thought provoking, and in some ways, there were some of them that were literally before their time, because we're still building off that. But I don't think you have to throw it out. I just think that it has to evolve like everything else. That part of the reason why iPhone works now is because it's built on the technology that was created years and years ago. You didn't throw the technology out, you just allowed it to evolve. And so I think we have to see the same thing. I think one of the missed opportunities, some of the challenges and what I see as some of the missed opportunities in the civil rights movement is, I think the civil rights movement had a missed opportunity around, and one of the mistakes of the civil rights movement is, as we're coming up on the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington, while when we look at who was really leading a lot of the work on the ground and doing the organizing, there were women. But when you look at the March on Washington, this march of us coming together talking about civil rights and why the people should be in power, women were not allowed to speak. And so that was a fatal flaw, I think, of the civil rights movement, that the level of sexism, and that in many ways in our response to white patriarchy was to actually Black patriarchy, right? And that even though we organized very differently, because everyone who I've ever talked to would share that there were Black women and Black men together in those rooms making decisions together, organizing. If you know anything about the Montgomery bus boycott, you would know that Joan Cheshire, that the women, the night before, that the women were the ones that had organized the Montgomery bus boycott. If you know anything about Selma, Alabama, that while you saw the faces of the men on the front of the bridge that were beating on the Emmett Pettus Bridge, it was Amelia Boynton who actually had called Dr. King and the civil rights leaders 10 years earlier, and had started the organizing. So women were always a part of it. So we were always a part of it. And the way that we organize in our community has always been men and women working together. The challenge was that what our leadership was not fully valued, appreciated, or affirmed. And so we were asked to take a back seat based on, quote, what the times were, but also, quite frankly, we have to call it out because of sexism. And so I think the biggest mistake of the civil rights movement was its inability to actually be able to lift up, affirm the contributions and the voices of Black women and women.
Yeah. So going back to your analogy, going back to plumbing, so you said that it didn't change. But what do you think? What would be needed to get the plumbing changed?
I'm sorry. Ask me again. I'm
so you mentioned that when I asked what hasn't changed in the society, that the plumbing hasn't changed.
Yes,
and so what do you think? What would be needed to get it changed?
Well, oftentimes I'll take that analogy and follow that analogy through. One, the same kind of pipes that you used before, you might not need those pipes anymore. You might need a different kind of pipe. Right? There are people that there's different materials. And I'm saying that in jest, but seriously, I do think that part of an evolution is really being able to not be so attached to what was, but to actually radically reimagine and think about what will actually serve us to move forward. And sometimes within the political context, particularly when there's a certain level of safety, human beings, we're a little resistant to change. We all are. No matter who we are, I'm a change agent. And, I often tell the story that I went to my favorite grocery store and they changed the spice aisle. I thought I was going to have a heart attack. I was like, what are they doing? Right. And my whole life is around change. And so as human beings, there's a part of us that we like normalcy, and we like there's security in knowing what we're used to and what we're familiar with, right? The challenge is, the danger of that is that it doesn't allow you to grow. It's kind of like with an athlete. When an athlete is preparing to go to compete, they have to push themselves beyond what is normal. They have to actually tear muscle to build muscle. They actually have to push themselves to beyond the point of pain to really be able to develop their endurance. And so I think part of what we have to do is, I think that there's a level when we're talking about changing the pipe, and I think I often tell people this, and I use this analogy. I use this question everywhere I go. I ask people, and I'm going to ask you all to be my participate in this with me. I'm going to ask you to kind of just close your eyes for a moment. And I'm going to use America for the sake of America, but I'll say the world. And so my question to you is, what would America or the world look like, wherever you are, look like without racism? Like, how would institutions be organized? What would the education system look like? What would the monetary system look like if racism did not exist? And you can open your eyes. I raise that question because no matter where I go, whether I am lecturing at Harvard, whether I'm in a community center, no matter where I go, 98, 99% of the people, oftentimes 100% of people, have never been asked that question before. And so my second question, as a follow-up question to that, is, what have we ever created in the world that was not first envisioned? Before anybody made an iPhone, they envisioned that. Before anybody made a TV, somebody had a thought about, what is possible? And created. Can we show this on this too? My point is, it is going to require, I'm hoping there's some young people that are going to listen to this and to see this. We need some young people that are thinking of themselves, not just as citizens of an existing nation, but founders of a new nation. Does that mean you have to change the nation and all that? But I mean, perhaps, but that's not what I'm calling for. I'm calling for a mental, a shift, that we have to start thinking of ourselves as founders of the next generation. It's like Star Wars. Like, this has got to be the new generation, the next generation, right? How are we thinking about systems, right, that are going to accommodate, right, the new reality that we have a multiracial, multi-generational, that people are living longer, right? But then we also have a younger population. We have people who are shifting ideas around everything from gender to what marriage, all of those things, that how can we accommodate where people have decided to evolve? That the idea isn't for the political system not to evolve and to stay the same as the people evolve. The political system must evolve. So when you're talking about change the pipes, perhaps there needs to be a complete replumbing, right? That it may be a different kind of thought process. Perhaps you make it's kind of like a house. I bought a 23-year-old house now, and I'm like, it's not the most efficient way, the way that the house was built. I'm making the house a smart house, right? That means I'm going to actually have to change some of my piping, and some of the places I've got to replace that with something different. I've got to be able to create a water garden that I can catch rain. It's a more efficient way for me to use water and to reuse water. My point is, why do we apply that for everything within the consumer space and not think that applies when we're talking about in the political space, right? And the reason why is because there are those that actually benefit from the status quo. They benefit when there is no change. And so it is going to require us, some of us are going to have to, what I often say, radically reimagine every single system in this country, and to think about, how do we deliver a better product, a better process, in a way that is going to meet the needs of the new reality of people who are actually populating the earth.
You're talking about the future, and this is very inspiring. But as a historian, I also wanted to ask you a question concerning the past. In recent years, there have been proposals concerning reparations, right? Ta-Nehisi Coates has written a very famous piece for The Atlantic, making a case for reparations. How do you relate to those proposals?
Oh, I am absolutely. Matter of fact, my organization 2 months ago, we just launched a reparation fund. We actually have set aside resources that we're giving to groups that are doing work around reparations. The part of at the core of the word is to repair, right? It is, if you go in and you bust open the pipes You can't just leave the water running, or even if it's a little drip, it's still dripping, right? The damage that was done, let's say you open up the pipe and you did and it dripped down on the roof, and then now you actually take the pipe together, you still got to fix the roof. You still got to fix the floor where the drip took place. And so part of what we've not seen in this country is America's never really addressed the institution of slavery or sharecropping or how structural racism has been embedded in every system, not to the extent in which the damage took place. There's one thing that there have been some things. Yes, there's been affirmative action, have been those things. But even when you look at it, and even affirmative action, white women actually have benefited more from affirmative action, even the people of color. And that's great too, right? But fundamentally, the structural damage that the exploitation of a people's labor for over 200 years. I mean, hell, I'll be the richest country in the world too if I had millions of people to work for me for free. So, I mean, with the full exploitation of their labor. And so that at the end of the day, when we're looking at, and does it matter? Absolutely, it matters. Let me tell you how it matters. It matters because my grandfather, who actually was half white, his father actually is relevant. His father was a farmer and owned land, and actually in a time, this is in the early 1900, 1905 and late 1800s, he literally lived with his Black wife and raised his children in a family because he had land, he had some protection around it. He left his children land. Their white cousins took that land, right? And so here I am, right? Years later, 50 years later, 100 years later, well, maybe 100 years later, that would have been the 362 acres, whatever acres of land that went to a white distant cousin should have been my land, right? That has had do you not think that had a significant difference on their wealth? The difference in their wealth and my wealth? Absolutely. Right. And so the point is that their reparations is not something that's new to the world or new to the US. What it has is it has not been applied or in the US. One, because I don't think that the US has ever really, really authentically dealt with what it has done, how it has benefited from the institutional slavery. And not just in terms of our labor. What many people don't know, there's a book called The Half Has Never Been Told, that in that book, it talks about how literally when the US was actually going into global markets and the trade markets, that it was the bodies, it was our actual bodies, the mortgages of Black enslaved Africans that were used as securities to allow this nation to be able to trade. So it wasn't just that there were companies, there were institutions of higher learning, insurance companies, that all of the foundation of their wealth came from the bodies and the labor and the exploitation of enslaved Africans. And so I raised that it's fine if it's interesting, nobody wants to talk about reparations, but anybody want to give away that money that they got and have been building on for years and years and years. And so the truth of the matter is there's a larger question of not just how the slave trade has actually marginalized and created this big gulf, this economic gulf. Even currently right now, there was a study that was done by Ford a few years ago, and I might get the numbers a little off, but they're close around in this range, that if you gave we say, well, education and money will make the difference. The economic gap is so big in the US that if every Black person had a PhD, which was the highest in terms of education, a PhD, and were given $1 million, I just want you to just for the sake of fun, a quiz show. How many years do you think it would take us to catch up to literally be able to fill the gap, find the economic gap?
Tough question. I would say a century.
208 years. It is damn near impossible. And so this notion of reparations is not about giving something. It is about how do you correct and repair the harm, the economic, the generational and structural economic harm that has been done to communities. And then it would be different if it was just around slavery. There has been an onslaught and an ongoing of the extraction of wealth from our communities that continues to this day. So yes, I am all for reparations. That should be, I think that is a core issue and a core policy issue that we should be in discussion around the world. How do we repair people? How do we repair the legacy of communities that were exploited and dehumanized, and wealth, their labor, their intellectual capital was actually extracted and exploited?
Let's talk a little bit also. Let's talk a bit again about the future. Now, you play the game with us. Now, I would like to ask you to close your eyes, and we are 55 years. So 68 happened 55 years ago. Please close your eyes and imagine America in 55 years from now on. How would the ideal country look like for you?
What I would like the country to look like for me
in 55 years.
In 55 years, I would like to see Madam President. I would love to see a woman president. I would love to see a political body. Not sure if it would be Congress in the same structure that it is in right now, that is more reflective of the people that are in this nation. That we would not have a Senate that's full of old wealthy men. That we would have a Senate that would be reflective of, generationally reflective. When we look at gender, when we look at ideology, when we look at race, that we would have a political body that were reflective of the people that make up this. We would have systems of wealth that were not determined, not be at that social justice movements, and those who were doing this work were not totally dependent upon the philanthropic kindness of a few, even though that's great, but that there would be a different kind of structure, that we would have campaign finance reform in such a way that you did not have we would not see the billions and billions of dollars in a presidential election or in a Senate race, but that we would have real financial campaign finance reform that would actually even out the playing field, that we would have a Supreme Court that saw themselves as really merely in their job as they're supposed to, is to interpret the law, but to not necessarily become a political tool for a impeached president to actually inflict its values on the rest of us, instead of protecting civil rights laws and or taking away laws that have been won. One, that we would see people who were working less, making more, that were healthier, that people would have, that seniors would have spaces to actually be able to feel valued and loved and would not die of loneliness, that our children were treated like they were our most precious resource, that we would put as much time and energy in them as we do on protecting something as futile as gold or diamonds, but that they would be a priority, that children would all have access to quality education regardless of what zip code that they lived in, that housing was actually truly quality housing was affordable, that people would not be locked out of their own communities because they couldn't afford, because speculators had came in and rose the prices, which were artificial prices. So I think that I am hoping in 55 years, we will have smarter people in charge, young, who are young now, who are listening now, that have just like I could not have, 55 years ago, you could not have imagined that there would be a computer this small that could do everything in a matter of seconds in my hand. I want someone to think about that in terms of, and I do, around social justice, and then as we're looking that the planet would be in a better place, that we would all wake up and realize that climate change, that's real, and that all of the major nations would come together and do their part around protecting the planet, since they've done the bulk of the damage to the planet, that we would have a space that, regardless of your sexual orientation, or regardless of your political or your religious ideology, that we would have a space that and a culture, we would just have a nation's culture, a global culture, to recognize the humanity in each other. I'm not one of those folks that I believe in like the this ultimate utopia that, oh, we're never gonna get along. We're not getting along is fine. Like that's not our problem. To me, that's not the problem. The problem is in America is like, we all got to be the same. I think that's precisely the problem. The idea that we're all the same. Well, no, we're not the damn same. I don't want a rose to look like a tulip. I like tulips and I like roses and I like sunflowers. And we know that they can all exist given the right circumstances and their right needs. And so I am hoping in 55 years that there's something with this beautiful thing that we call our planet, that we have been gifted with the opportunity to walk on the earth with other amazing human beings, right? And that we are gifted with the opportunity to either cause pain or to cause joy and love, and that we choose to move more towards that space of love. Like I think in America, I think our problem isn't that we don't know how to get along. I think we don't know how to fight. We believe that I mean, we're gonna fight. Animals fight. That's natural, right? But to fight to destroy, human beings we should have evolved. I mean, even this whole concept of war is really silly, y'all. Like the idea of I'm gonna kill you, whoever kills the most people means that I win. Like, what is that? Like that's like the ultimate, like, just anyway, I'll just say, like, I'm hoping in 55 years that there's a generation that is coming into power in every aspect of our society that feels some sense of urgency around protecting the planet and protecting people. That's my dream.
It would be a very nice closing word. But I'd like to ask whether anyone else has maybe a final question. We are slowly coming to the end of our session. But if anyone has a final question.
Yeah, I actually did have a question sort of related to what you were talking about with maybe like what you would like to see in, like 55 years, which, you can kind of consider like within our lifetimes, or at least within my lifetime. I'm 29. But I would say, like, in
I'll probably be dead. I'll be 107, but I don't know. My granddaddy lived 104, so I might be with you.
Yeah. But I think, like, when looking at like reality and history, you can kind of recognize that like political and social progress in general like does take time, and sometimes like a lot of time, like, on the scale of decades maybe. So I guess my question is, like, what would you say to people who may feel kind of like discouraged that, like, change is slow and it may take decades to happen? Like, what would you how do you kind of like feel about that? What would you say to people about that?
No, I love that. I always use this religious analogy, this faith analogy around. I'm like, Jesus had 12. I mean, I'm saying that in jest, but I'm really serious. That at the end of the day, if you go historically and you look at movements, even if you look at the formation of this nation, it has always been a committed few that had the vision, had the gumption, had the courage, and radical dream of what I would love in 50 years are all the things that I talked about, right? The reality is just what I do know, it is absolutely possible, which is why I said towards the end, what is absolutely possible, that it is absolutely possible for in 50 years for there to be a different kind of leader. That there are young people who are in their 20s growing up in a world, you can get information at your fingertips, right? That you can actually find the communities, you can find the information, that there is a real opportunity. I really do believe this, that there's a real opportunity for a new generation to help us get this right, to actually move into positions of power. And just like we've changed the ball game in technology, we've changed the ball game in every consumer area I can name, right? That if we also look at the quality of life as a cornerstone to real wealth, and I mean wealth in the sense of human value, around the quality of life, that I do believe that in 55 years that we can have an amazing group of young leaders who think differently, that actually think, we know that young people already think very differently around race. They think very differently around economics. They think very differently around work. That I think that all of those things can be shifted and used and directed in a way, just as I talked about earlier, around how anger or fire or energy can be directed in such a way that there is a new vision around moving not just this nation forward, but the world forward. That we can have a global leadership of people who are courageous enough to say that we should be sophisticated and evolved at the point that the only way that we resolve things can't be our go-to to go to war and an atomic bomb that is going to help people disintegrate. And like, what kind of insanity is that you're going to drop a bomb that people just disintegrate? Like, what's wrong with you? Right. That I think that we have the ability for people to actually think about what is so wrong with everybody having health care. Worst case scenario is poor people get way up. What's so terrible about that? What is so terrible about having a more equitable distribution of wealth so that people's basic needs can be met? Yes. Are we going to have violence, some level of violence? Absolutely. But can we impact that? Yes, we can. We're actually living in a period of time, believe it or not, that literally is one of the least violent periods that we've ever had in the world's history. The world has been traditionally extremely violent. And so we've been able to evolve on some level to be able to impact that. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity. I think we're creative enough. I think young people are imaginative enough. I think young people have been exposed to enough and information that in 55 years, there's no doubt in my mind that if young people who are really listening and thinking about this now, as they are evolving and pushing us to evolve around our beliefs around human value and human rights and civil rights, that we will absolutely be even in a better position in 55 years and a more evolved humanity.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you. Any other final questions, maybe? If not, then I would like to thank you so much, LaTosha, for joining us today. I really learned a lot today, and I hope the others did so too. And the recording will be available on YouTube as usual. Okay. Thank you so much. And for the others,
thank you so much.
Thank you.
I would like to mention that the topic of the next salon in this series will be the alt-right. So we will be happy to see you again. And thank you so much for joining us today, and have a great rest of the weekend. Thank you and bye.